Hi everyone, I'm Ria. Welcome back to our music theory journey. Today, we're continuing our exploration of Schoenberg's theory of harmony, and this is already episode 11 in the series. In the last video, we talked about modulation, how to actually change from one key to another. If you don't quite remember, I recommend going back and reviewing that lesson first. Now, the topic of this episode is closely related to modulation, but it's fundamentally different. Today we're talking about secondary dominants and diminished seventh chords. Last time, our focus was on how to truly shift keys. But secondary dominants work differently. Instead of changing the key, we temporarily treat a non-tonic degree of the scale as if it were the tonic. Then we place a dominant chord or a dominant seventh chord in front of that temporary tonic. For example, take a look at this diagram. We're in C major. Now, let's say we want to target the second degree chord, which is D minor. We can put an A seventh chord in front of it. That's the dominant seventh of D. We name this as dominant seventh chord of the second degree. Even though D isn't the tonic in C major, going from A seventh to D minor creates a momentary feeling of dominant to tonic resolution. So, a secondary dominant, as the name suggests, is just a dominant or dominant seventh chord placed in front of a chord that isn't the tonic in order to momentarily give it that tonic gravity. Now, because this involves chords that don't naturally exist in the home key, you'll often need to use accidentals. That's because the dominant chord of a non-tonic scale degree often uses notes outside the diatonic set. Why do we need secondary dominants? The reason is simple. They give us extra harmonic tension and direction. By inserting an artificial leading tone and using strong root motion, usually a descending fifth, we can make even non-tonic chords sound like little temporary centers, adding drama and depth to our harmony. Before we jump into writing musical phrases with secondary dominants, there are a few technical details I want to clarify. First, how do we construct them? Start with a chord in the key, say, the second degree chord, and build a major triad on its dominant. That's your secondary dominant triad. If you want a secondary dominant seventh, just add a minor seventh on top, forming a dominant seventh chord. This applies in both major and minor keys. Also, secondary dominant sevenths are more common and generally more effective than their triad-only counterparts. Second, you can introduce chromaticism through smooth voice leading. For example, if you move from B natural to B flat in a single voice, that can bring in a C seventh chord, which functions as the dominant seventh of F. Schoenberg recommends putting this kind of chromatic motion in the outer voices, especially the bass, because it adds melodic interest and energy to your counterpoint. Third, keep it balanced. Secondary dominants should make up no more than about 20% of your harmonic material. Otherwise, the music starts to feel overly restless. Fourth, how do these chords resolve? In most cases, the root moves down a perfect fifth, just like a standard dominant to tonic motion. But there are rare exceptions. Sometimes the resolution is a second, mimicking deceptive cadences that go from dominant to subdominant, or the sixth degree. These can be effective, but beginners should use them cautiously. Fifth, and this is important, secondary dominants are not modulations. They're moments of tonalization, where one chord in the key is temporarily given the spotlight, as if it were the tonic. But from an analytical standpoint, we're still within the original key. So don't jump to a new key signature. Just explain it in the context of the current key. Sixth, one common use of secondary dominants is to extend cadences. For instance, a dominant seventh of the dominant chord can lead to a cadential 6/4 chord, then to dominant, and finally to tonic. That said, the cadential 6/4 and dominant chords can be omitted if needed. It's flexible. All right, let's listen to a chord progression that includes some secondary dominants. Now, let's talk about diminished seventh chords. These can act as replacements for either dominant chords or secondary dominants. First, the structure. A diminished seventh chord is a diminished triad with two stacked minor thirds, plus another minor third stacked on top. That means every interval between adjacent notes is a minor third, or 3 semitones. This unique symmetry means that the chord divides the octave into 4 equal parts. For example, in C diminished 7th chord, if you go up a minor third from B double flat, you get C. From C, up a minor third is E flat, and so on. Because of this structure, the same diminished 7th chord can be interpreted in 4 different ways. C diminished 7th can also be seen as E flat diminished 7th, G flat diminished 7th, or A flat diminished 7th, depending on what chord you resolve it to. That's why Schoenberg called it a vagrant chord. It wanders from key to key, never settling down. How do we resolve a diminished 7th chord? The most straightforward method is to move the root up a second. For example, the C diminished 7th might resolve to D minor. Of course, other resolutions are possible, such as down a 2nd or 5th, borrowing from secondary dominant behaviors. Another advantage, diminished 7ths don't need preparation. You can just drop one in for dramatic effect, no setup required. And functionally, they're incredibly versatile. They can create harmonic tension and smooth out voice leading, especially when dominant chords feel too heavy-handed. They're stealthy, stylish, and efficient. Let's listen to a progression that uses a diminished 7th chord to see how it sounds. Since we still have a bit of time, let's briefly summarize some key points from Chapter 11, Rhythm and Harmony. First, at this point in your studies, don't worry about combining rhythm and counterpoint just yet. Focus on mastering harmony first. Second, Schoenberg points out that rhythmic ideas often exist more freely in a composer's mind than our current notation can express. So when you start composing, don't be afraid to break the rules. Ignore bar lines, be spontaneous, and follow your inner rhythm. Third, and this answers the question in the original script, cadential 6/4 chords should be placed on strong beats because they function as part of a delayed dominant, not as a tonic chord. That strong beat placement reinforces their dominant tension. As for dominant 7th chords, they are flexible and can appear on either strong or weak beats, depending on the phrasing and style. But for maximum impact, strong beats are still a good general rule. All right, if you're up for it, now's the perfect time to try writing some chord progressions that use both secondary dominants and diminished 7th chords. Try it in different keys and see what kind of tension and resolution you can create. I'm Ria, and if you're interested in learning more about composition and harmony in a structured way, feel free to follow my channel. I'll see you in the next video. Bye-bye.